March 15th, 1899. Sheriff Harlan Cole pushes open the barn door and stops breathing. Not because of the smell, though the smell is there, layered and ancient, the kind that settles into wood over years and cannot be scrubbed out. Not because of the darkness, though the darkness inside is wrong. Too thick, the kind that feels inhabited. He stops breathing because of the silence. Because there are 8 compartments built into the walls of this barn, and every single one of them has chains bolted into the timber at wrist height and ankle height. And the chains are worn smooth, not from livestock, but from something that pulled against them for a very long time. He has been a lawman for 22 years. He will resign in 4 months. He will never explain why. You need to understand something before we go further. What happened inside the Caldwell farm did not begin with violence. It began with a Bible. It began with a widow standing at her husband's grave with 5 sons beside her, and a congregation weeping around her, and every single person in that valley looked at Miriam Caldwell and saw grief. They were wrong. What they were actually looking at, though none of them would understand this for 15 years, was a woman who had just been handed everything she needed. 5 sons, a remote farm, a community so committed to minding its own business that it would hear screaming from the ridge on certain nights and decide collectively that it must be the wind. The Appalachian Mountains keep secrets the way deep water keeps bodies, completely, patiently, with no particular interest in giving them back. Harrow's Peak sits in a valley where the fog comes in every morning and some days never fully leaves, where the trees on the western ridge grow at angles that have nothing to do with wind direction, where 3 separate families across 3 separate generations have reported that their dogs refuse to approach the tree line bordering what used to be the Caldwell property. Animals know things. They knew what was happening in that barn years before any human being was willing to say it out loud. They would sit at the edge of that pasture with their ears flat and their bodies trembling and make a sound that wasn't quite growling, something lower, something that people who heard it said felt less like warning and more like mourning. When investigators finally opened Miriam Caldwell's private ledger, 312 pages, meticulous handwriting, 14 years of record keeping, the first thing they noticed was that there were no names in it, no women's names, only numbers, physical measurements, and a column she labeled Outcomes. 47 children were listed in that ledger. 47, sold to families across the mountain counties who believed they had completed legitimate adoptions. Those children grew up with other names in other homes, never knowing what their existence had cost. The women who produced them, the women whose initials appear in column 1 of every entry, are not listed anywhere in the county's official record. They came from somewhere. They disappeared into a valley and a barn and a woman's theology, and they never came back out. This is a story about 5 sons who were born into something and survived it, and eventually, on a cold April morning before the sun came up, did the only thing left that they could do. It is a story about a woman who believed so completely in her own divine authority that she built a chamber to prove it It is a story about chains, who puts them on, who wears them, and what happens on the night the two things finally switch. And it is a story about whatever it is that still walks the ridge at Harrow's Peak when the fog comes in and the dogs go quiet and the world holds its breath. Stay with me, because some of what follows you will not be able to unhear, and some of it, the parts that happen in the dark, in the spaces between what the official record admits, some of it, I want you to decide for yourself what it means. The day they buried Josiah Caldwell, the sky above Harrow's Peak turned the color of a bruise. Not the clean gray of an ordinary overcast morning. Something deeper, more deliberate, as though the atmosphere itself was registering what the people below could not yet see. The community gathered in their best clothes on that cold November morning of 1884, their breath rising in pale clouds, their voices joined in hymns that bounced off the mountain walls and returned to them slightly wrong, the way echoes sometimes do in deep valleys, arriving back a half-second late and a half-note lower than they left. At the center of it all stood Miriam Caldwell, tall, still, dark-eyed, a woman so composed in her grief that Reverend Silas Brewer would later write in his diary that she seemed less like a widow and more like a woman arriving at a destination she had long been anticipating. Josiah had been a hard man, but a fair one, a farmer, a deacon, a father who kept his sons working from first light to last. In his absence, the community mobilized with the particular efficiency of mountain people who understand that survival is collective. Neighbors offered labor, merchants extended credit. Women from the congregation arrived with food and scripture. Miriam received all of it with grace, thanking each person with the precise words they most needed to hear. Her 5 sons arranged behind her like soldiers at attention. Elias, the eldest, was 20 years old that autumn, broad-shouldered, quiet, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's watchfulness. Nathan stood beside him, then Caleb, then Seth, and finally Abel, just turned 18, his mother's unspoken favorite in ways that would later make investigators go cold when they understood what that favoritism truly meant. Within weeks of Josiah's burial, the first signs appeared, though no one in Harrow's Peak had the context to read them correctly. Miriam began visiting Reverend Brewer's study with increasing frequency, always at odd hours, always unannounced, always carrying a worn Bible whose margins were so dense with handwritten annotations that the pages had gone stiff. She came with questions, specific, unsettling questions about bloodlines, about the obligations of sons, about biblical precedent for families who separated themselves from communities she had begun calling spiritually contaminated. Brewer answered carefully, a gentle man who never imagined that each answer was being cataloged and repurposed. It was in those early visits that Miriam first spoke of the voice, not God directly. She was careful about that, as though she understood that claiming divine communication outright might trigger alarm. She called it a revelation, a clarity that had come to her in the days following Josiah's death, a certainty that her family had been chosen for a purpose requiring isolation, purity, and absolute devotion to the bloodline her husband had begun. Brewer wrote in his diary that her eyes, when she spoke of this revelation, had the qualities of lanterns burning behind glass, bright, contained, and utterly without warmth. By spring of 1885, the Caldwell sons had begun to disappear from public life. Not all at once, which might have raised immediate alarm, but gradually, the way shadows lengthen before anyone notices the light is failing. Elias, who had attended every barn-raising and harvest festival in the valley, simply stopped coming. Then Nathan. The explanations Miriam offered were always plausible. Illness, farm work, spiritual retreat. No single absence was alarming. It was only in retrospect, when Sheriff Cole laid out the full timeline, that the pattern became visible and terrible. The general store's proprietor, a meticulous man named Daniel Ashby, kept records that would later serve as some of the most damning evidence at trial. He noted the changes in Miriam's purchasing habits. Medical supplies in quantities, no farming family required. Heavy chains, she explained, were for unruly livestock. Laudanum, she claimed, treated her son's ailments. Ashby had seen those boys. None of them looked ill. But Miriam had a way of making concern feel like discourtesy, and so he wrote notes in his ledger margins and said nothing to anyone. It was the special orders that should have broken through the silence. Padlocks, restraining equipment, midwifery instruments, each order accompanied by a perfectly reasonable explanation. Each explanation delivered in Miriam's calm, unhurried voice. Each worried thought Ashby had was quietly buried beneath the social architecture of mountain courtesy, which demands you assume the best of your neighbors until the evidence makes assumption impossible. What was happening inside the Caldwell farmhouse during those months? The systematic psychological dismantling of 5 adult sons, the slow replacement of their identities with roles Miriam had designed for them, would not become fully understood until Dr. Lenora Fitch conducted her psychiatric evaluations after the 1899 raid. But the foundation was being poured here in the quiet months of 1885 and 1886, while Miriam constructed her theology brick by careful brick, and her sons were learning, slowly and with great pain, that the word no had been quietly removed from their available vocabulary. The journals she kept during this period, discovered beneath her bedroom floorboards during the raid, reveal a woman operating at the precise intersection of genius and madness. Her handwriting in the early entries is controlled, almost beautiful. She wrote about Josiah with an absence of grief so complete it reads as relief. She wrote about her sons with the language of a livestock manager assessing assets, and she wrote with increasing frequency and specificity about what she called the Lord's Commission, a task assigned to her bloodline that required things she described in terms so clinical they are more disturbing than any explicit language could be. The last entry from 1886 ends with a single sentence that Sheriff Cole reportedly read 4 times before he could fully process it. The barn is ready. The Lord's work begins in spring. Brewer made his final diary entry about Miriam Caldwell that same month. He wrote that she had attended Sunday service, approached him afterward with a strange light in her eyes, and informed him that earthly religious institutions were no longer necessary for her family's salvation. He described her smile as utterly devoid of human warmth. It was the last time he saw her in a public setting. It was the last time anyone in Harrow's Peak saw Miriam Caldwell as anything other than a rumor, a shadow moving between a farmhouse and a barn at hours when decent people were asleep. There are places in this world that absorb what happens inside them, not metaphorically, not in the poetic sense that we speak of a home feeling warm or a battlefield feeling mournful. Literally, the walls of the Caldwell barn, when investigators finally walked through them in 1899, felt different from ordinary wood. Deputy Marshal James Whitmore, a man known for his pragmatism and his contempt for superstition, wrote in his official report that the air inside the barn had a quality he could not name. Heavier than outside, warmer despite the March cold, carrying a smell that was not quite blood and not quite earth, and not quite any animal musk he had ever encountered in 20 years of rural law enforcement. He attempted several descriptions, crossed all of them out, and finally wrote, "The smell of time that has gone wrong." He left it. He couldn't find better words. Miriam's modification of the barn began in the autumn of 1887. To the outside world, it appeared as routine maintenance. Reinforced walls, new stalls, overhead beams, she told Ashby, were for expanded feed storage. What investigators found in 1899 was the reality beneath that explanation: 8 individual compartments, each sealed with heavy iron locks, each furnished not for cattle, but for human beings. Straw pallets, chains bolted directly into the hand-hewn timber at wrist and ankle height, a small oil lamp fixed into the wall at a height that made it impossible for anyone restrained below to reach it. The detail that made Deputy Whitmore step outside and stand in the cold air for several minutes before he could continue his documentation. The central space, what Miriam's journals called the examination chamber, was the detail that broke the men who first walked into it. A long wooden table, its surface worn smooth in ways that no one in that barn ever wanted to think about too carefully. Iron brackets at each corner. Above it, hanging from the ceiling beams, a series of hand-drawn charts, anatomical, clinical, the kind of diagrams found in medical textbooks, annotated in Miriam's precise handwriting, with observations, schedules, and what could only be described as performance notes. The charts tracked fertility cycles. They tracked outcomes. They treated human biology as a system to be optimized, the women on them reduced to numbers and physical measurements, and a column labeled simply Result. It was in the summer of 1888 that the disappearances began. The mountain communities surrounding Harrow's Peak were accustomed to the occasional traveler who went missing on the ridge roads. The terrain was unforgiving, the weather unpredictable, and not every absence represented foul play. What Sheriff Cole would eventually recognize years later was that the women who vanished near Caldwell land shared specific characteristics. Young, 18 to 25, healthy, from families with limited resources and limited reach, whose grief would not generate the kind of prolonged search that might bring investigators too close to the valley floor. Miriam had chosen with the cold intelligence of someone who had studied her environment and understood precisely how much disappearance it could absorb before anyone asked the right questions. The first sign that something was profoundly wrong came not from the sheriff's office, but from the land itself. Or so the people of Harrow's Peak have always maintained. Old Cecilia Marsh, who farmed less than a mile from the Caldwell property, began reporting that her livestock refused to graze on the side of the pasture closest to the Caldwell Ridge. Dogs, she said, would approach the tree line and stop, hackles raised, trembling, making a sound she described as less like growling and more like mourning. Her own sleep became disturbed, filled, she wrote in letters to her daughter, preserved in the County Historical Society, with dreams of women reaching through fog with their hands outstretched, mouths open, in a silence that was somehow louder than any sound she had ever heard while awake. Cecilia Marsh was not an imaginative woman. She was 73 years old and had survived a war, 2 husbands, and a winter that killed half the valley's cattle. When she told her daughter she believed something was reaching out from the Caldwell land, her daughter believed her. Inside the barn, Miriam's sons were learning what it meant to be instruments. She had prepared them for this, not through violence alone, though violence was present and plentiful, but through years of systematic psychological architecture that had replaced their individual identities with a single shared purpose. She spoke to them in the language of scripture, of sacrifice, of duty to bloodline and obedience to God's will, as she alone interpreted it. She withheld food, withheld sleep, withheld the basic human currency of warmth and approval, until her son's sense of self had eroded so completely that what remained was not quite men and not quite children, something in between, something that had forgotten how to want things for itself. Elias, who had once written letters to a medical college in Charleston, letters Miriam had intercepted before they could be sent, letters that still existed in a shoebox under her bed when investigators searched the farmhouse, became the eldest instrument, his compliance purchased not through love, but through the precise understanding of what happened to those who refused. Nathan broke first, then bent, then stopped, distinguishing between the two. Caleb and Seth moved through those years in a dissociative state that Dr. Fitch would later identify as chronic trauma response, so severe it had restructured their fundamental capacity for autonomous decision-making. And Abel, youngest, 18, his mother's unspoken favorite, was still in the process of being shaped when the letter came that changed everything. What the women brought to that barn encountered is not something this channel will describe in clinical detail, because the official records contain that detail, and this is not what they deserve to be remembered for. What they deserve is this: they were real, they were young. They had names that Miriam Caldwell removed from them and replaced with numbers, and we will say those names before this story ends. The graves behind the barn, 7 in all, when the full excavation was completed in the summer of 1899, were unmarked. The women buried there had arrived with histories and futures and people who loved them, and eventually heartbreakingly, stopped searching. Whatever else that barn took from them, it does not get to take their names. The county coroner's report, filed as Exhibit A at trial, confirmed that the adult remains showed evidence of complications from childbirth, malnutrition, and untreated infection. The coroner wrote his findings in the detached language his profession requires. Then he went home and, according to his wife, sat at the kitchen table without speaking for the rest of the evening. Sheriff Harlan Cole had been working the mountain counties for 22 years when the first anonymous letter arrived on his desk in the spring of 1896. He had seen enough darkness to approach most things with professional distance, the kind his deputies admired and his wife quietly mourned. The letter shook him, not because of what it said exactly, but because of the handwriting, pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had torn through in 2 places. The writer described sounds coming from the Caldwell barn on certain nights of the month. Always the same nights, always the same sequence. Crying first, they wrote, then chains, then something underneath both sounds that had no name in any language designed for the living. Cole filed the letter and began watching. His observation logs from 1896 and 1897 are among the most methodical documents in the county archive. Precise timestamps, weather conditions, distances, descriptions of movement on the Caldwell property at hours when no legitimate farming operation required human beings moving through the dark with lanterns, supply wagons arriving before dawn. The systematic absence of all 5 Caldwell sons from every public space for the better part of a decade. And Miriam, always Miriam, moving between the farmhouse and the barn with the purposeful efficiency of a woman running an operation she had long since perfected, down to its smallest detail. What he could not document, and therefore could not use, was what neighbor Samuel Briggs described in a private meeting that autumn, a meeting Briggs initially refused to allow Cole to record because he feared what Miriam would do if she learned he had spoken. Briggs had been awake in the early hours of a moonlit night when he saw something at the edge of the Caldwell pasture. A figure, a woman he did not recognize, standing perfectly still in the moonlight with her arms at her sides and her face turned toward his property. He watched her for nearly a full minute. His wife called him from the bedroom. When he looked back, she was gone. He moved his bed to the opposite side of the house the following morning. He told his wife it was his back. He said nothing more about the figure to anyone for 2 years. Cole's breakthrough came in stages. The first, the abandoned campsite of Mary Elspeth Reed, 20 years old, reported missing 6 weeks earlier while traveling to visit her aunt in the next valley. Her belongings scattered with the particular violence of a struggle rather than an accident. Among them, a torn piece of paper bearing Miriam Caldwell's handwriting, an offer of domestic employment with directions to the farm written in the casual specificity of someone who had written them many times before. Cole's hands were unsteady as he read it, not from age, from the sudden, certain knowledge of what he was holding. Armed with what little physical evidence the campsite provided, Cole spent the better part of a year building a case sufficient for a limited search warrant. Limited because Miriam's connections in the county seat ran deeper than anyone had acknowledged, and because the judge who finally signed the warrant did so with a reluctance that suggested he was half expecting to find nothing and half terrified of finding something. The warrant restricted Cole to the barn's outer chambers. What he found beneath the hay bales stopped him where he stood. Medical records, not for livestock, for women. Each file documented physical assessments, cycles, and outcomes. Each woman identified not by name but by a number and a physical description that Cole, cross-referencing his missing persons reports across one sleepless night, was able to match to real names. Real women. Real families who had sent him letters he had been forced, for lack of evidence, to file without action. The financial records appeared alongside the medical documentation. A parallel ledger system demonstrating with horrifying clarity that Miriam Caldwell had transformed her barn into a profitable enterprise. Infants born from her operation were sold to families throughout the region at prices reflecting what she called, in her own handwriting, the quality of the stock. Buyers identified by coded initials, profit margins carefully calculated, a business mind operating inside a theological framework that had removed every human consideration from her accounting. Cole's official report, filed the following morning, contains a sentence that has been referenced in every account of the Caldwell case written since. I have in my career witnessed evidence of many crimes. I have not previously encountered evidence of a crime that appeared to be proud of itself. That night, walking back to his horse through the Caldwell property in the dark, Cole heard something he never included in any official report. He told his wife about it years later, near the end of his life. As he passed the barn, his deputies already at the gate, the horses restless in the way animals go restless near certain places, he heard something from inside the locked central chamber. Not chains, not crying. Something quieter, like breathing, slow and rhythmic, and coming, he said, from more than one place at once. He stood at the barn door for a full minute. Then he walked to his horse and rode away without looking back. He did not sleep that night. The anonymous letter writer was eventually identified during the trial as Samuel Briggs, the same neighbor who had seen the figure in the pasture. When asked on the stand why he had waited so long to come forward, Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had told himself for years that what he saw that night was a trick of the moonlight, that he had almost convinced himself, but that there are things a man sees that his mind cannot file away cleanly, and that the figure in the pasture had been one of those things, and that eventually he had understood, without being able to say exactly how he understood, that whatever he had seen was asking him to do something. The courtroom was silent after he said that. The judge did not strike it from the record. There is a particular horror in documentation, not in chaos, not in violence committed in a moment of rage and then denied, but in the horror of a record kept, of a system maintained, of a human being sitting at a desk in the quiet of an evening, writing numbers in columns while other human beings breathe and suffer and pray for help in a building 50 yards away. Miriam Caldwell was, above all things, a documentarian of her own crimes. And it is this, more than any single act she committed, that defines what she was. When the full raid was executed on March 15, 1899, and Cole's deputies finally breached the door of Miriam's private office within the barn, a locked room that required 3 men with crowbars to open, what they found was the administrative heart of an operation running for over a decade. Filing cabinets, correspondence, a master ledger running to 312 pages of meticulous handwriting. In that ledger, 47 children, 8 years of transactions, buyers identified by coded initials and locations, prices varying by what Miriam described as characteristics and parentage, with premium rates applied to children she designated as pure mountain stock. Cole read the first 20 pages at the scene. He did not read more that day. He sealed the ledger, entered it into evidence, and assigned a deputy to guard it overnight, because he did not trust himself to carry it without doing something he would regret. The physical evidence found in the Caldwell Sun's quarters completed a picture that the prosecution would present as the most thoroughly documented case of captivity and coercive control in Appalachian legal history. In Elias's room, chains. In Nathan's, medical documents recording his own participation, written in a hand so tormented that Dr. Fitch would testify it showed signs of a man writing in dissociative episodes, recording events as though they were happening to someone else entirely. To a stranger he was observing from a great distance. In Caleb and Seth's shared room, nothing but 2 pallets on the floor, 2 pairs of boots, and a small carved wooden cross that Caleb had made as a child and had refused, across everything, to leave behind. Abel's room was the smallest. He had arrived at his 18th birthday, having never, as far as investigators could determine, spent a single unsupervised hour outside the Caldwell property since the age of 15, his education administered by Miriam, his theology administered by Miriam, his understanding of the world, of other people, of himself, all of it filtered through a single source who had devoted years to ensuring the filter produced a specific output. Dr. Fitch's report describes him in clinical language that somehow makes it worse rather than better, as a person whose autonomous identity had not been suppressed so much as never permitted to form. The letter that broke everything was found in Elias's belongings. Dated March 1st, 1899, written in Miriam's controlled and certain hand. It informed him that Abel would begin contributing to the family's mission upon the upcoming spring equinox, a date she had identified through her own biblical and astrological calculations as one of particular spiritual significance. She had acquired 3 new women for this purpose. The letter provided details that the prosecution entered into evidence and that the jury foreman later said turned every member of the jury pale, one by one, as they read it. The letter was the line that Elias, after 14 years of broken submission, could not cross. He had survived by telling himself that his participation was coerced, which it was, that he had no choice, which was true in ways a free person cannot fully comprehend. He had survived by building, in the deepest interior chamber of himself, a small locked room where he kept the person he had been before 1885, and visited it in the dark when Miriam was asleep, and promised that person he was still there, still real, still somewhere under everything, himself. The letter told him that Abel, the boy he had helped raise, whose childhood nightmares he had talked him through on dark mountain nights before any of this began, would not be spared. And that, finally, was what the locked room required him to act on. He began planning that night. What the psychiatric evaluations conducted by Dr. Fitch revealed about all 5 brothers was something that the court had no precise legal framework for in 1899, and that modern psychology has since spent decades trying to adequately describe. 5 men who had been, in every meaningful sense, destroyed and rebuilt according to a blueprint they had not consented to, whose ability to recognize their own suffering as something they deserved to be free from had been systematically removed, who had been kept not just through physical restraint, but through a theological architecture so total that the chains on their wrists were almost secondary, almost, to the chains Miriam had constructed inside their minds over years of careful, patient, devoted work. Dr. Fitch wrote in her evaluation summary, "It is the opinion of this examiner that these 5 individuals represent not perpetrators acting in concert with their captor, but rather the most complete case of psychological captivity I have encountered in my professional career." The question of culpability is not simple. The question of suffering is. The spirits of the Caldwell barn, if that is what they were, if the accounts of 3 generations of Harrow's Peak residents are to be taken as more than the product of collective grief, grew louder in the final weeks of March 1899. Cecilia Marsh's granddaughter, 14 that spring, told anyone who would listen that in the nights before the raid she would wake to find her grandmother's chickens gone completely silent. No clucking, no movement. The total suspension of animal sound that she said was the sign that something was moving along the ridge road that the living had no name for, something that passed through the space living things occupy without actually being one of them. She was 14 years old. People did not take her seriously. Later, after the raid, after the graves, after the ledger with 47 entries and no names, they did not dismiss her as readily. At 3:47 in the morning, on April 2nd, 1900, a man who had forgotten how to want things for himself remembered one: to be free. Elias Caldwell had spent 6 weeks manufacturing a key from a splinter of barnwood, working by feel in absolute darkness during the hours when Miriam slept, testing it against the lock of his shackle with the patience of a man who understands that patience is the only resource he has left. When the lock finally opened, when the iron fell away from his wrist with a sound that seemed, in that silence, as loud as a gunshot, he lay completely still for 3 full minutes, just breathing, feeling the absence of weight from his skin, trying to remember what his hands had felt like before they had worn those grooves into the iron from years of pulling against something that would not move. Then he got up, and he went to find his brothers. The Caldwell sons had been communicating for months through a system so simple it had survived every attempt Miriam made to monitor them. scratch marks in the barn walls, a code built from a counting game they had played as children. Before all of this, in a world that felt now like something that had happened to different people. The plan they had assembled through those marks was detailed and coordinated, designed with a specificity that investigators would later note reflected both the intelligence of the men involved and the absolute clarity that comes when someone has nothing left to lose and one thing left to protect. They moved through the barn in darkness they knew better than any light. They had lived in that darkness. They understood every sound it made, every shift in air that signaled Miriam's presence somewhere in the building. They reached her quarters, the room she had built for herself inside the barn's eastern wall, where she slept in order to maintain proximity to her operation. And they opened the door with a key she had once displayed to them as proof that they could never escape, a key Elias had spent 2 years locating. What happened when Miriam Caldwell opened her eyes to find 5 sons standing over her in the dark is recorded in Elias's confession and in the confessions of each of his brothers, all of them consistent in every detail in the way true accounts are consistent and fabricated ones rarely manage to be. She did not scream. She did not plead. She looked at them with those lantern eyes and said, in the same calm voice she had used for every scripture recitation and every order and every threat across 14 years, "You are committing a sin against God." Elias, in his written confession, recorded that he looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Then we'll bear it." They used her own chains, the same gauge, the same iron, the same bolts, driven into the same wood she had chosen and ordered and installed. They secured her to the examination table, the wooden platform at the center of the barn, the one with the iron brackets, the one whose surface bore the record of a decade of atrocity in its very grain. They left her with water and a lamp. Then they walked out of the barn one by one into the cold April air, and Elias pulled the door shut behind him. He said in his confession that the sound of the latch clicking was the first moment in 14 years that he felt certain his heart was still somewhere inside him, beating for reasons of his own. They rode to Cole's office before sunrise. When Cole's deputies entered the barn to take Miriam into custody at dawn on March 15th, they found her exactly where the brothers said they had left her, chained to her own table, lamp still burning, eyes fixed on the ceiling with an expression that Deputy Whitmore described in his report as one he had never encountered on a human face and hoped never to encounter again. Not fear, not anger, not madness. Something that looked, he wrote, and then almost crossed out and then left, uncomfortably, like satisfaction, as though this, too, was something she had anticipated, as though even this ending had been accounted for in the ledger. The trial lasted 11 days. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Miriam Caldwell was sentenced to hang, and on a Tuesday morning in October of 1900, the sentence was carried out. The brothers tried separately, their coercion exhaustively documented by Dr. Fitch, received sentences ranging from supervised release to 2 years detention. The court acknowledging in its findings that 5 men whose entire adult lives had been conducted under conditions of captivity and psychological destruction could not be held to the same standard of culpability as someone who had chosen. The barn burned on the night of the execution. No cause was ever formally determined. The fire started from the center of the structure, from the area surrounding the examination table, and consumed everything wooden in under an hour. What remained was the iron, the chains, the bolts, the brackets, all of it still standing in the ashes, in the rough shape of the stalls, as though the fire had burned around them with intention, as though something had specifically wanted them to remain, as record, as witness, as the only testimony that would outlast everything else. Cecilia Marsh's granddaughter walked to the Caldwell property the morning after the fire and stood at the edge of the ash for a long time. She said the dogs did not tremble at the tree line that morning. She said the air felt different, not clean exactly. Nothing about that land would ever feel fully clean, but lighter, as though something had been waiting a very long time for something else to finally be finished. And now it was. The chains are still there, if you know where to look, half buried in decades of leaves and rain, and the slow, patient work of earth reclaiming what was left behind. People who have gone looking for them report, sometimes, that in the fog, in the early morning, when the light hasn't fully committed to arriving, they see things near the ruins they cannot explain. Figures at the tree line, a stillness that has texture, a silence that feels somehow like it is listening back. We leave that for you to decide. The Caldwell case appears in no national historical record. There was no newspaper crusade, no federal inquiry, no landmark legislation passed in the names of the women whose initials fill Miriam's ledgers. The children sold through her operation grew up in other homes with other names, most of them never learning the truth of where they came from or what their existence had cost. The brothers lived out their remaining years in degrees of silence that Dr. Fitch, who maintained correspondence with Elias until his death in 1934, described as the silence of men who had seen something that language was not designed to carry. Elias never left Harrow's Peak. He is buried less than a mile from the charred outline of the barn, which may tell you something about the human need to stay close to the things we survived, as though proximity is the only proof that survival was real. We do not have all their names. The women who disappeared into that valley, we have initials, physical descriptions, the cold arithmetic of Miriam's outcomes column. We have the graves. We do not, for most of them, have names. That absence is itself a crime. The final crime, the one that outlasted the chain and the table and the barn and the woman who built them. It is the crime that this story exists, in part, to refuse. They were real. They were young. They had futures that were taken from them inside a building that Miriam Caldwell described, in her own handwriting, as the house of the Lord's work. Whatever else that barn consumed, it does not get to consume that. We say it here, even without their names, because saying they existed is the minimum the truth requires. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed, but they can be lit. That is what we do here. Every story, every case, every name we manage to recover from the silence it was buried in. The fog above Harrow's Peak never fully lifts. The chains are still in the earth, and somewhere in the county archive, in a folder with a handwritten note on it that reads, "For the court only," the sealed pages of Miriam Caldwell's ledger still exist. Waiting as things in deep archives wait for someone with enough nerve to open them and enough honesty to say what they find tonight. Wherever in the world you are watching this from, you were that person. You stayed. You witnessed. And that matters more than you know.